Welcome to Lit Happens, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicated to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Lit Happens with Adriel and Belle. It's nice to have you on today listening to us. Our episode is going to be, we thought we'd get some Module C texts underway. So we're going to start with the pedestrian. So Adriel is here.
Hello, how are we?
And Adriel is going to be taking us through the very popular but excellent short story, The Pedestrian. And what Adriel's going to do for us today, guys, he's going to take us through an examination of it under that Module C lens. So Adriel's going to make some connections back to the rubric there, and he's going to take us through this idea of the essentials of storytelling, how an audience can become engaged, what are some key literary techniques that the author is using to create engagement, how characterization can represent or encourage engagement, and also how do we then adapt or, reinterpret some of these really great techniques or ideas within the pedestrian in order to captivate a diverse audience. So I might just let you take it away then, Adriel. Let's get started.
Awesome. So we're looking at a few different things here, especially in regards to The Pedestrian, which I think is a fantastic text. I think it's also, I love this text for getting kids into that imaginative, creative headspace, which we see Ray Bradbury uses quite a few of these ideas, like, there's dystopic ideas, which are relevant in a lot of the texts that we have. We've read things probably like, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451s, like all these types of texts, and even more contemporary audiences will look at your films. Students love their films like Mad Max and, films alike, Blade Runner, a few different types of texts, which I think this Pedestrian really encompasses quite a few of these, futuristic, dystopic sort of ideas, which kids can really take a hold of. So, look, it's going to be a bit of an exciting time in these next 20 to 25 minutes, and we'll delve into how it works. Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, let's get started then. I guess our first question is, we're sort of thinking about who determines the meaning of a text. And how does that actually relate to the Module C's objective of enhancing writing skills? If we can start there, Adriel.
Awesome. So again, we have to sort of go back into this. Remember, Mod C is building off of the stuff that the kids have learned in the Reading to Write unit for their prelim course. So Mod C definitely does challenge us to advance the writing skills. Okay, and this is where students have to critically engage with texts like The Pedestrian. So here we sort of see things like, Bradbury taking the lead in shaping meaning, where we have to look at considering how he uses his language. We have to look at examples within the text. So, how he might use things like anaphora, which is, the repetition of things like this idea of him being isolated or alone. This is Leonard Mead, the main character within the text. Whilst, things like juxtaposition might, pit his solitary sort of presence against a city, teeming with this idea of absent life. It's quite an interesting story. I do really like these ideas, but remember, we have to critically engage with the text. It's like, how has he actually used language, structure, and form to develop this? So the short story's form especially looks at amplifying this as well. So we've got examples of the grey phantoms, for example. These seem to manifest upon the inner room walls. It's a recurring motif that critiques technology's haunting grip. And this is made potent by this word called brevity. Brevity is actually an interesting sort of word. 2 years back, actually, in the Standard Marking Center, it was one of the key words that we looked at as markers. And the idea of brevity, if we were to define this, it is concise and exact use of words in your writing. So that definitely means that, I always encourage this with my students when it comes to your imaginative writing, your short stories, that every single word that they use, every single punctuation mark that they use, every single sentence that they develop needs to mean something. It has to have a purpose in their piece, because they only have maybe about that 600 to 800 words in developing these imaginative creative pieces. And if you are filling this up with a little bit of fluff, well, you're losing sort of this idea of brevity. It's quite a key word. So really emphasize that with your students. I think that's quite important. And as teachers, you need to get your head around what this idea means. Like, what does it mean to have a text that has or encapsulates brevity? We can also look at things like the structure in this text as well. And we see that the structure unfolds gradually. If we look at, this quote where it's like, he walked through a city as if it were a sea bottom, with this idea of a pathetic fallacy, maybe, another technique that we can consider, casting the city as a decayed relic. And he sort of ends us abruptly then with, the car moves down this empty sort of street. Again, I'm paraphrasing here. And an ellipsis that mirrors the sudden loss of the autonomy that we see with our main character in Leonard Mead. So Leonard Mead, I should say, sorry. Bradbury's intent is clear here, okay? And it's one of the purposes. I generally say this with imaginative and short stories as well. It has to have a purpose. Like, students think that we can just start writing without, like, and sort of let the road sort of, if we quote Robert Frost here, the road's not taken. We let the universe decide where the story goes. Yeah. I think that's very difficult when you get into a finite text that is required of students in the HSC, for Mod C in particular. So really have this purpose. So, for example, for Bradbury, his intent is clear. He looks at things like ideas how technology might stifle individuality. Yet you, for example, as the reader, and this goes back into who shapes the meaning of a text, might look at, it from a contemporary lens. So for me, for example, in 2025 Australia here, we see it very differently to maybe the original intentions, and we might have that postmodern sort of lens when looking at the way Bradbury sort of develops some of these texts. For us, this isolation, this sort of this idea of technology stifling individuality, might evoke something like an idea like desolation. So Mod C here aligns here by analyzing, these techniques, and you've got things like the ironic zeugma, where, quote, he walked for air and answers, linking the tangible and abstract ideas. These are the things that make your piece very, very engaging. It gives the piece brevity, and it definitely allows for a higher band response when it comes to the marking center, because you've got to sort of think about it. Each marker is probably looking at the piece for about 5 to 7 minutes. Within that 5 to 7 minutes, you need to sort of not only engage your reader, but every single word, like we say, the brevity, it counts. It has to be concise. It has to be specific, because remember, the idea of shaping meaning not only is developed by the author in this case, but again, in that postmodern sort of lens, as a marker, we're sort of looking at it like, oh, well, why? And how does this relate to me? Or why is that story going to continue to be engaging? So one of the activities that you might consider, is really taking a snapshot maybe in the story. I've done this previously with one of my standard students. She got an artwork, for example. She looked up an artwork, and we sort of looked at this idea of framing within the piece. So there's a moment in the story where Leonard Mead goes to this corner. He's standing on this crossroads, and you've got these perspective of him looking into the windows. All right. Now, this girl's taken this perspective of the human being or the individual that might be standing inside of this window and framing the story of Leonard Mead, and starts to paint this picture. And they have this, this canvas in which they develop a beautiful story, and that becomes the motif. So
that's cool.
I think when we start to look at these sorts of things, we need to sort of step away from the cliched sort of ideas of, okay, this is just a general dystopic text, but like, how can your student, or how can we get our student to really engage with things like extended metaphors, motifs, examples like anaphora, as opposed to just your simple sort of repetition, the use of like your punctuation to really, really create this piece that draws the reader or the marker into their story. So it's very, very important there.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. I love that concept that you said, the idea of brevity in a piece, because I think you've made a really nice link to brevity doesn't just happen, it's achieved by thoughtfulness. And so the more thoughtful and targeted you are with your purpose, and then you shape your narrative and your structures around that, the more brevity your piece is going to have. I think
Yeah.
that's excellent advice. So what about then, obviously storytelling, the power of storytelling is a really kind of key aspect of module C as well. So this idea of the role of storytelling in captivating an audience, how might how might teachers encourage students to examine how Bradbury is using this storytelling to captivate? What might we say there?
So he uses many different features, and I think I'll just start with this. I know I've read in one of these textbooks. One of the things that we need to probably get our students to think outside of the box with is the fact that the story doesn't start with the traditional type of orientation. You know, we're so conditioned to speak about our in the beginning or once upon a time, or, you know, we want to sort of establish a setting. We want to give a whole backstory of our characters, and, you know, this is what kids sort of fall into. But again, we've only got 600 to 800 words to develop a piece.
Yeah.
Now, this was quite an effective thing. If we're looking at like Freytag's pyramid, you know, we want to start developing that tension straight away. What is that engagement? And I think it's very important for us to look at something like Bradbury's piece here. We start off with this complication. It's sort of like a climatic moment. Why is this guy walking down this street? You know, why is there nothing but him and, you know, technology or these tomb-like buildings that encase him or surround him? I think that's the question that we got to ask. And that is, when we ask that question, that's when we're engaged. So we're looking at storytelling's idea, and then Mod C in particular, when we look at some of these texts, we're looking at storytelling's power to captivate an audience, you know, and this is a skill that students can definitely refine through their study of the pedestrian. We see that Bradbury's language really hooks us into the text. So I just made reference to those tomb-like buildings, for example, you know, and the use of pathetic fallacy here to shroud the city in deathly stillness, whilst we look at, you know, the light held and fixed like a museum specimen, employs a zeugma to sort of bind physical restraints with existential faith. Okay, now if you're sort of wondering what a zeugma is, you know, this is a figure of speech, a word that applies to two words in different scenes. Okay, and we're looking at this in regards to you know, these ideas of the tomb-like structures, the light. It's quite interesting here. But I like this idea. Okay, the zeugma is used to bind physical restraint. Okay, remember, he's held by the light there with this existential fate, like what is going on with society. And then that's just that dystopic sort of idea. And see how we start to ask these questions. We're getting our reader to think. We're getting them to understand the story at a level beyond just that surface level, which gets students to step away from that cliche, which I think is quite interesting. We also see the structure here starts with tranquility. Or there's this tranquil sort of start where, you know, he listens to the faint push of the soft shoes through the autumn leaves amongst the sidewalk. So we've got this motif of sound threading through. This then escalates with some of this ironic dialogue. So he's asking, like, walking where? He doesn't know. Okay, so it's like this robotic sort of reply. And this is marked by, you know, that ascendanton, which is, you know, reflected in this following quote, quick, cold, mechanical. And this drives tension relentlessly. So these are some of those higher order sort of techniques that we want students to look at. So again, the ascendanton here, I sort of struggle with saying it sometimes, but I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it.
You did great.
This is the omission or absence of a conjunction between parts of a sentence. Okay, so this is where we get the kids to start to look at the way they're using their language, their structure in order to drive some sort of purpose. Okay. Now, again,
and even their sentence structures. Yeah,
exactly right. Okay, so we look at some of these ideas, you know, which drive this tension through the story. And then again, we look at that idea of brevity again. I keep harping back onto this. We looked at, you know, those tombs, for example. It's another motif. It's hauntingly brief. It sustains our focus. And this is where we start to see these ideas of storytelling becoming something that is of great importance. It matters because it reflects our world, the world in which we live in. Okay. even the world in general. Remember, we're in like this globalized world now, and we can look at, this idea of people and individuals and how we sort of rely on screens. That's the idea of screen time is now become a massive thing. And
Yeah.
this provokes emotion through Mead's sort of, quiet rebellion. Why is he outside in nature? Why is he walking the streets? Why is he, enjoying time with the rustling of the leaves, with the, crunching of the leaves, should I say, under his feet? The greens contrasted on the sidewalk of the grass with the concrete. Like, these are all the different things that we see used by Bradbury to really, really push his idea here. So there's a few different things that we can consider, but what we see is Bradbury's complex techniques show storytelling isn't just words. Okay, it's an emotional sort of tether that gets us to really think about his purpose, which is to really speak about some of the or foretell us, I guess it's foreboding in a way, or foreshadowing, as to the consequences of technology and what could happen if we were to allow it to, take a hold of our lives. So it's a very interesting piece, and it really has quite an important sort of idea when we relate it to our lives.
You've given us so many suggestions there on, significant aspects of the storytelling in a way that students can connect with, but also consider what they can use moving forward. I think you made a really, really cool point, that idea of, you are limited by time. And so backstory is not always going to be possible, I should say, not so much necessary, but possible. So, maybe you need to think about, does your story require a backstory, or can you get into the tension? Or maybe if perhaps it needs a little bit of backstory, what's one clever way that, a student could perhaps maybe incorporate that? Could they do a flashback? Could they have some sort of thing or object that they're looking at? I think that's really great. And I really love all the juxtapositions in this story, because it's funny, because on one hand, you think like plot wise, perhaps it's so simple, because he's just walking down the street. But the complexities with, why he's there and what he's observing and the comparisons that he's making. So that's wonderful. That's excellent. Well, if we were going to drill down then into, because you gave us a really nice example of all these kind of big picture techniques that influence the storytelling of the Pedestrian. What kind of literary techniques might we zone in on that are used by Bradbury that maintains the engagement of this work?
Cool. So there are a few different techniques that we can consider when we're looking at Bradbury's work. Now, I'll just go through a bit of a list, and if you're listening and you've got a bit of time, you can definitely jot these down. I won't explore them too much in depth, because I think, as teachers, we definitely have ability to go on and expand in our own sort of writing. But if we're looking at some of the techniques that are key to Bradbury's writing here, we've got we've just mentioned things like juxtaposition, pathetic fallacy. We've got motifs. We've got, the look at, in particular, the zeugmas, like I've mentioned this before here as well. But it's very important because his language paints the world. We also look at things like, the sorry, give me one sec there. Got a bit of a throat thing.
Yeah,
his
that's
language
okay.
his language captivates, quite a bit of, the alienation, I think, in particular. I think I mentioned anaphora as well, beyond just like your repetition there. So there's a few different techniques there. I also say the structure lures us in slowly, all right? So the way he structures his piece, the way he uses dialogue in particular, which really engages students, because sometimes students will like to use dialogue. Sometimes teachers will say, well, we don't want to see dialogue, but I think it's important that dialogue is actually quite key at times if used effectively. Similar to what you just sort of mentioned there. It's like, well, a backstory, we don't want to give all of our stories our characters' backstories, but an effective piece will actually weave the backstory into the way that they create their piece through the techniques that the student actually employs in their writing. And that's very, very important for us to consider. It's not one of those
insights.
Yeah, exactly right. It's like, how have you weaved it through the story, as opposed to just giving me a simple, basic
Like, here it is over 4 or 5 sentences, and
Yeah,
now I'm back in my story. Yeah.
exactly right, exactly right. So it's quite important for us to consider that when it comes to our writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then again, with the short form, I think motifs are key. Get your students to
Yeah.
really think about a title that's sharp.
Mm.
It may unsettle people. It may get kids to think about it. I know there was this effective short story back in, I think, '07. I still like to look at it. It's called The Boy.
Mm.
Any teachers
Yeah, it's
that
a
are
great
listening might
piece.
actually listen to it. And it's
Mm.
fantastic. It's a fantastic piece because it's literally about this kid reminiscing about his time with his older brother, and they
Mm.
cleverly use this motif of a boy floating out in the ocean. And the
Mhm.
time span is like it's just this kid swimming out to this boy, and then you're just thinking about the way that it reflects his brother's life and whatnot.
Mhm.
Again, I won't ruin the story, but if you look it up, it's fantastic.
There's a lot of, yeah, that's a great one, because there are a lot of parallels to, like, a kind of chronological sort of moment in time, but then
Yeah.
through the weaving of the techniques, you actually get the tension of that backstory. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
And
wonderful.
like I said, we've mentioned quite a few different techniques here, but I will say this.
Mm.
Bradbury definitely uses this in a tight form. Okay, so Bradbury's
Yes.
layered techniques, and this is what we want to point out when we're actually annotating the text. It's his layered techniques. So it's layered. Techniques don't just work independently, they work with each other in order to
Mm.
foster meaning and convey
Mm.
purpose to the audience, and not only convey purpose, but engage the audience as well. And this is what we want to encourage our students to put into or push into their own texts. So
Mm.
by, by layering the techniques, he ensures that the pedestrian grips us. Okay, and this is
Yeah.
probably the biggest part of how we work our students towards that band 6 response.
Amazing. That's brilliant. That's so brilliant. And then, so when we're looking at characterization, which is obviously really important in any kind of text, because it's this idea of the narrative, the worldview. So, how would we use characters' worldview
Mhm.
in a text, and how is that worldview represented through the language and the storytelling?
Yeah, yeah. So when we're looking at Mod C here, it demands this idea of like a mastery of perspective. Okay, so
Hmm.
we need to really, really make sure that the perspective is pretty clear in the piece that we're producing. And we see this in the Pedestrian. It uses a third person limited narration, which reveals Mead's inner world, Leonard Mead's inner world, the protagonist's inner world. And the way we sort of see this is his language paints it. We can see this in the line where he says, like, he stood upon the corner of an intersection and peered down long moonlit avenues. So the motif of light and juxtaposition of this word peered against a passive city reflect his curiosity. This
Mm.
contrasts with
Yeah.
the robotic accidenton, with what, where, and why, which is a stark
Mm.
sort of mechanical foil. The structure flows gently, um, as he continues to listen to different things. And we see quite a bit of this, all right, through the whole text. And we also see that the short form locks us into Mead's lens, his perspective. We've got elements like the dark windows, that represent that motif of isolation. And this is unfiltered by those outside voices. Um, we also see, this idea of Mead observing these TV lit houses, through lines like
Mm.
the glow pulse like a heartbeat. Um, so he structures the text and the way he uses language from this calm manner to this tension that we feel. And remember, the tension is, this alienation and this sort of isolation that is
Yeah.
ensued by the encroaching technological sort of
Yes.
advancements,
Yeah.
in this world. And this is like that purpose that he's trying to push. So I think it is very important for us to actually be pushed into that character's worldview, because when we engage with the character, that you are pushing, your student is pushing, we can then sort of look at the world through not only their lens, but get that engagement, with the audience, the respective marker in particular, and get them to think about things in their own world. And it's definitely a great tool for reflection as well later on down the track, if this piece gets you to reflect on it, as some of the questions actually require the students to do as well. So it is tightly
Mm.
framed, and Bradbury's techniques such as motif, juxtaposition, brings what Mead's worldview alive for us to emulate. It's quite an interesting sort of thing
Mm.
here.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's great. So moving on then, if we can, well, how, because obviously the author is really powerful in any text because they're representing their own kind of world, or they're representing a lens of which to look at issues, and that I think ties into its purpose. So
Mm,
what is their messaging or didactic intent, perhaps?
mm,
So,
mm.
well, what do we then discern about authors when they're weaving their own personal experiences into their writing? How do we see that play out in Bradbury's The Pedestrian?
Yeah, yeah. So again, in Mod C, we're exploring how experience shapes our craft as well, and that's quite important. And we see this again in The Pedestrian, when Bradbury sort of unveils this through the language that he uses and the structure that he uses. Now, we've sort of
Mhm.
spoken about a few techniques already, which we've sort of covered, and we looked at the short form sort of urgency throughout the piece. But what we see is we discern that Bradbury as a romantic, resists this sort of stagnation. So his life is
Mm,
woven into the craft. So when we're looking at this encouragement for students, we want to encourage them to weave, their craft or their experiences into their craft, I should say. So we see
mm,
with the way he uses mead here, for example, there's a defiance into, he looks at this idea of defiance and he turns this into a memory.
yeah.
um, you know, there's just a bit of like that rebellion that we sort of see, um, which is juxtaposed with the freedom that he feels, walking down these streets.
Yeah.
So I think in particular, when we're looking at, these ideas of brevity, we're looking at, these concise pieces of work, it's very, very important for us to not only, write this A to B narrative, but we're looking at a piece that will engage with our human experience as well, because that is what sort
Mm,
of presents to our marker as a point of
yeah.
engagement. I think that's quite important for us to
Yeah.
consider. So Bradbury's personal lens really shines through the way that he constructs his piece here in The Pedestrian,
Mm,
and
mm,
we can take it, in many different ways, shapes, and forms, but you'll see the overarching sort of ideas remain consistent, and we get a very good snapshot into what Bradbury was really trying to produce. The purpose was clear. The Like you said,
yeah.
didactic intent was very clear with this piece. No matter how many interpretations we can have as a contemporary audience, we can all
Yeah.
agree that there are some key human experience or experiential sort of ideas that remain relevant and continue to resonate. And this is why this text is still such a great piece, for
That's right.
all audiences.
I think that's really great. That's really great advice because you, like you said, at the end of the day, who's marking these responses for students? It's adults with lived
Mm,
experiences, with human experience. So the
yeah,
more thoughtful students can be in those mimetic kind of ideas and purposes, then perhaps the more effective their response will be in engaging a wide range of
yeah,
audiences. Well, that's wonderful.
exactly.
So thank you. That's so great. So then, um, how can we then adapt? So this is, I guess, now moving forward. So, we've done this really great deep
Mm,
dive. We've looked into all the ways that the pedestrian is engaging and
mm.
using storytelling devices. So how do we then adapt this kind of text to reinterpret an experience that might captivate a new or different audience? And I guess this
Yeah,
is where we're now applying what we know of the pedestrian in
yeah.
producing a response. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And this is the whole purpose of Mod C, all right? It's all about like how do we adapt, how do we get inspired by the text that we read, and then how do
Mhm,
we sort of allow this to manifest in our own writing for the
mhm,
students. And we see
mhm.
this in The Pedestrian when Bradbury sort of reimagines, um, his own walk here. So his language really reframes this,
Mhm.
and we can see this in the lines. Like he was just walking, just walking. So the amphora again. We've mentioned these techniques quite a few times, and I've only mentioned a few, but these are the ones that sort of resonate with me. It turns into routine. The routine, sorry,
Mm,
into defiance. It's
yeah.
ironic against those the motif of the grey phantoms there. We see the structure shifts as he walks through the city, and we see that pathetic fallacy again of that lifeless city to an ellipsis. That empty riverbed streets followed by the
Mm,
ellipsis, recasting
mm,
sort of this idea of peace as a threat. So when we look
mhm,
at some short form sort of adaptations, we see in the 1950s in Australia, sorry, Fears for 2025 Australia. Okay, like what's going to happen with
That's
technology? Are
cool.
we going to have
Yeah.
flying cars? We're going to have technology running our homes. I mean, we see this with the police car in the Pedestrian. You know what
Oh, that's
happens, and
right.
we've
Yes.
manifestations of this now. If you look at like contemporary China, for example, they've got robotic police now, and you know, drones that sort of follow people, and the way cameras sort of in cities like London really track your every single step. So you know, these sorts of ideas of the imagination are now becoming lived realities, and this is sort of what
Yes.
Bradbury was presenting, and this is something that allows the piece to sort of remain relevant throughout time. I think that's quite important for us to consider.
Very true.
So, you know, Bradbury's complex craft here reinterprets experience. That's the important thing, and engages diverse audiences, because the way he looks at this idea of what the world may look, future worlds may look back when he wrote this text, is still a relevant question to us today. However, we're living a lived experience of some of the ideas that he presents in his text, which is quite interesting. And this is that engagement that a top quality band 5, band 6 response will definitely evoke within the reader or the marker, and get them to those higher end marks when it comes to a Mod C response.
Amazing. So then what are some suggestions of ways that teachers can springboard off of this with their students? Like, do you have like an idea or two, or a technique or two? Any ways to adapt Mead's walk into something that's more modern, perhaps?
Yeah, look, like I was saying, you know, you get you get your students to think about snapshots, all right? So it's like our journey, all right? Our journey throughout the Pedestrian becomes complete. We see his use of language, structure, and form, and the many examples that we sort of looked at, you know, that third-person narration, the dialogue, anaphora, just to name a few different things. But they craft an engaging dystopia. Okay, so when you're looking at this idea, you know, you might give your students some sort of symbol, maybe an idea. You might even get them to go outside and have a look at nature around them, and get them to actually frame something.
Amazing.
When it comes to it, you know, get them to walk through maybe the alleys of your school, the hallways of your school, I should say, or, you know, get them to walk along maybe that nature part or here, and really get them to feel the story. And I think once you get them to experience it, then they can really get that experience into their writing, as you know, it's being inspired by their walk in particular. So in order to craft that imaginative piece, you know, get them to have purpose, really get them to think about structure. Like I said, don't start with that traditional orientation. Get them to that climatic moment. Like, start your piece with the climax, hook your reader in, and really, you know, get them to experiment. This is the other thing that I will say. I mean, I've had this with a few of my students recently, is, you know, they want to write that perfect piece right up, but they don't plan, they don't sort of craft. You know, it's called the craft of writing. So you really have to, like, you know, go back to the drawing board after each sort of sentence, each word, think about how you're using it. And I know we've got, you know, time pressures when it comes to study and all this sort of stuff, but you'll see that the kids that develop the craft of producing a great imaginative piece, short story, they're the ones that shine when it comes to the marking center responses, and it'll definitely be something that will be looked upon favorably, I think, when, you know, your kids are producing great literary text, and it gives them an enjoyment with writing as well. So it's definitely something, you know, that gets them to think about their writing with cohesiveness, conciseness, and, you know, really encapsulates that idea of brevity that I introduced earlier on in this little pod.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. You have done an amazing job at highlighting all the wonderful attributes of the Pedestrian, and really making, I think, us all consider, well, this is why it's a springboard text. This is why it's selected, because it is rich and there's so much that can be done with it. And then you've given some really brilliant ideas and strategies of how can teachers implement their own students springboarding off to try and create something on their own. And it's wonderful. What you've offered us is great. Thank you. Do you have any kind of final leaving thoughts to go with the Pedestrian?
I think the Pedestrian's a fantastic text. You know, even with the new HSC coming along and you're wanting to teach creative writing, I definitely would keep this as one of your texts to, you know, get students to really look at. I think it's fantastic. It's something that, you know, I know both of us will continue to look at. And again, if you're only using your HSC and you're going to maybe use it in 11, year 10,
Yeah.
get your kids to really read it. It's a fantastic text. It's short. It's accessible. It's understandable. It's funny I use that word accessible. We'll see how accessible some of the text on the new HSC might be for us.
Yes.
Just being able to access it, to be honest. But
Yes.
no, definitely is a fantastic text. And look, experiment, have fun. That's what creative writing is. That's
Yeah.
what creative writing is, and really get your students to enjoy that writing process. I encourage them to go through that. Make the experience good for them.
Yeah, definitely. No, that has been really amazing, Adriel. Thank you so much for all your great expertise on the pedestrian. We hope this really helps, teachers who maybe new teachers or teachers who are just looking for a new text to shake things up. Definitely a treasure trove of suggestions in this one. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, we're going to wrap up this episode here for today. As always, if you're enjoying what we're creating for you all, give us a like, subscribe, share. We would love to see in the comments or maybe get some emails about suggestions of what you would love to see an episode on. I know moving forward, Adriel and I are talking about the new syllabus, and we would really love to get some of your suggestions too, so that we can make our future podcast episodes really relevant for what you're doing in real time, because you're all doing God's work right now, especially during assessment period and marking and all of that good stuff. But yeah, just, support us and let us know how we can help and what we can do. And we're really excited that you're on this journey with us.